I am Gerald, 72 years old, and somehow still processing the night my own son tried to erase me from his life. As a retired logistics founder, I spent my life building an empire only to hide my wealth, to teach my son the value of hard work. That lesson failed miserably. Last night at exactly 1:00 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from my son, Cody. It read, "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us." When I came out into the hallway, there was Renee, my daughter-in-law, already positioned beside my packed bags, a smirk on her face. "Cody wants no argument," she told me. "Get an Uber." I gave a single nod, set my keys down on the console, and stepped out into the freezing rain. But once I was in the back of that cab, I fired off one reply. Of course I'll pull my direct deposits first. And one more thing, do you know whose name is actually on the deed to that estate? That hour 1:00 in the morning used to be the one I treasured most. The whole suburban estate would go quiet enough that it almost felt like a real home rather than something staged for other people's benefit. I'd been stretched out in the East Wing bedroom, wide-awake eyes tracing the ceiling, while freezing rain tapped a soft rhythm against the glass. The ache in my joints never let me forget how old I was. 72 years, a good portion of them spent hauling crates by hand before a desk was ever part of my world. Then my phone blazed to life on the nightstand, its screen punching through the dark. I grabbed it, blinking against the brightness. The name on the message stopped me cold. It was Cody. I held the phone there, reading the words twice, letting them settle. "We need distance from you. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge." I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into the story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just a quick one. What's the weather like where you are right now? There's something about sitting with a good story on a cold or rainy day that makes it land a little differently, and this one is going to land hard. Now, a quick note before we begin. Some elements of this story have been shaped for narrative purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. But the truth at the heart of it, that is very real, and it is what matters. Your presence is disrupting our lifestyle. Please stop contacting us. I read those words 3 times over. There had been no argument leading up to this. No blow-up at the dinner table, no raised voices echoing through the halls. Just this, a cold, bloodless dismissal fired through a phone screen by a man whose bedroom was a short walk down the same corridor. I eased the heavy duvet aside and lowered my feet to the hardwood floor. The chill hit my bare soles immediately. What I felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was something heavier, a hollow, sinking weight that settled deep in my chest. I pulled on my robe, my mind insisting on answers face to face. You don't push your father out the door with a text message. I moved out into the long, dim passage that ran the length of the upper floor. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the antique mantel clock sitting at the end of the hall, a beautiful, ornate piece. It had been Harriet's favorite. That familiar sound sent a sharp ache rising up through my throat. When my wife died 10 years ago, she left a void so vast I didn't know what to do with myself, and I made the worst decision of my life. I started handing Cody everything he wanted, thinking I was easing a grieving son's pain. What I was actually doing was feeding something I should have starved. The clock's soft hum seemed to ridicule every one of those choices as I made my way toward the main foyer. I turned the corner, fully expecting to climb the stairs to Cody's master suite. Instead, I pulled up short. Blocking my path, bathed in the glow of the crystal chandelier, stood my daughter-in-law, Renee. She was fully dressed in silk loungewear, arms folded across her chest. Piled at her feet were my 2 scuffed canvas duffel bags, already zipped shut and dumped carelessly on the floor. Renee showed no surprise at the sight of me. If anything, the corners of her mouth curved into a thin, self-satisfied smirk. Before I could get a single word out, she casually lifted her foot and pushed one of the bags in my direction. "Cody wants no argument," she said, her voice stripped of any warmth whatsoever. "Leave the keys on the console. Call an Uber." I stood there looking at the woman my son had chosen to build his life with. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't ask where exactly she expected me to go in the dead of a winter night. I dropped my gaze to the imported marble floor beneath my feet. I had paid for every inch of it. Each vein running through that stone had been purchased with decades of sweat poured into building my company from a single delivery truck. But standing there under Renee's sneer, a very particular memory surfaced. The day she married Cody. She had made an absolute scene over the wedding budget, insisting on a $75,000 ceremony to impress her high society friends. I had written that check in silence, handing it over without a word, naively thinking it was a one-time gesture to set them on solid footing. I understood now that she had never seen my generosity as a gift. She had seen it as a concession. I reached into my robe pocket and drew out the brass house keys. I crossed to the walnut entryway console and set them down. The metallic click rang out through the hushed, cavernous foyer. I didn't spare Renee another glance. I gripped the handles of my bags, pushed open the heavy front door, and walked into the biting cold. The freezing rain found me instantly soaking through my robe and cutting straight to the bone. But I never looked back. 10 minutes later, I was in the back of a damp, poorly heated taxi, giving the driver the address of a cheap roadside motel on the edge of town. The sharp smell of pine-scented air freshener filled the cab. I fished my phone from my pocket. The screen cast a pale glow across my wet-lined face. I opened the messaging app and pulled up Cody's text, the one ordering me to stop reaching out. My thumbs hung over the keyboard for a moment. I didn't compose some anguished paragraph. I didn't fire off a list of demands. I typed a handful of short, measured sentences. Of course, I will cancel my direct deposits first. One more thing. Do you know who really owns the estate? I hit send. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the tiny status indicator beneath the message. Within seconds, the word red appeared. The taxi tires hissed across wet asphalt as the dark city slid past outside. Through the rain-smeared glass, we rolled by the sprawling industrial park on the west side of town, the very ground where I had assembled my logistics empire piece by piece over 40 years, turning one rusted delivery van into a regional powerhouse. When I finally sold it, the liquidated assets came to $15 million, but I never gave Cody that number. I buried the wealth inside a blind trust, believing that keeping him in the dark would push him to build something of his own. It was an old man's fantasy. All it really did was make him feel entitled to whatever scraps he assumed I had. I glanced down at my phone again. The screen had come alive. 3 small gray dots bounced at the bottom of the chat window. Cody was typing. Then the dots vanished. Then they reappeared, moving faster. I could see it clearly in my mind, him sitting upright in his expensive bed, the color draining from his face as the weight of my message dismantled the little world he'd constructed. He was panicking. I didn't stick around for his excuses, his backpedaling, or whatever frantic explanation he was scrambling to put together. I pressed my thumb to the power button on the side of the phone and held it there until the screen went black, dropping the cab interior into darkness. The rain hammered the roof steadily as I pressed my head against the cold window glass. The reckoning had quietly begun. Gray morning light filtered through the thin plastic blinds of the highway motel, throwing pale, broken lines across the stained carpet. The fluorescent sign outside my window flickered with a weak orange glow, flashing a weathered vacancy notice into the freezing morning air. I perched on the edge of a mattress that gave nothing. The room smelled of old cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. I am 72 years old, a man who constructed a regional logistics empire from nothing, a man whose net worth sits comfortably in the 8 figures. And there I was, shivering inside a $55 roadside room on the edge of town, turned out into a winter storm by my own son. I hadn't closed my eyes once. My mind was running too hard, too precisely locked onto the bare facts of what had unfolded just hours before. The shock of standing in that marble foyer, staring at my bags on the floor, and Renee's smug expression had burned away entirely. What replaced it was a cold, absolute clarity. For years, grief had made me blind. When Harriet died, I lost the one person who kept me grounded. I tried to fill the silence inside that enormous house by giving Cody whatever he asked for, telling myself that his contentment would become my own. I told myself I was being a devoted father. Seated in that dim motel room, I finally stopped lying to myself. I hadn't been a father to Cody in a very long time. I had been a bank account with a heartbeat. I pushed myself up, my joints cracking in the cold, and moved to the small, scratched laminate desk wedged into the corner. I unzipped my briefcase and lifted out my laptop. The hinge groaned as it opened the screen, throwing light across my tired face. I connected to the motel's unsecured network and pulled up my secure browser. My fingers found the address of my primary wealth management portal almost from memory. The login required multiple layers of authentication. I entered each password with steady, deliberate keystrokes. The dashboard opened, laying out the full picture: liquid assets, checking accounts, credit lines, all of it. I skipped past the investment portfolios and went straight to the joint operational account, the one I had been foolish enough to tie to Cody's daily life. The transaction history filled the screen, a descending column of numbers that told the whole sad story. I let the data settle over me. Thousands upon thousands flowing out to high-end steakhouses, imported wine merchants, luxury car lease payments, and steep monthly dues for a country club Cody barely set foot in. Every line was a monument to a life built entirely on my money. He was performing the role of a self-made man on my dime. I scrolled down to the recurring transfers section. There, it was an automated outbound payment set to fire on the first of every month. $12,000. The memo field beside it read, Project Support. I kept my eyes on those two words. Project Support. 5 years back, Cody had walked into my study, clutching a glossy, poorly researched business plan. He told me he was launching a revolutionary tech startup and app that was going to upend the delivery industry. He spoke with fire in his voice, with a kind of desperate urgency, swearing. This was his chance to step out from under my shadow and carve out something of his own. He needed seed money, he said. He needed a monthly operating budget to bring on developers and lock down server space. I could see the business plan was riddled with holes. Any investor worth their salt would have tossed it without a second glance. But I looked at my son's eager face and heard Harriet's dying wish echoing in my head. Be patient with him, and I opened my wallet. There was no tech startup. There were no developers. The venture never got off the ground. That $12,000 a month quietly transformed from startup capital into a personal slush fund, feeding Renee's designer wardrobe and Cody's carefully curated public image. Month after month, year after year, the money dissolved into the bottomless pit of their vanity. I had known it somewhere in the back of my mind, but I'd chosen to keep my eyes shut. The fear of cutting off the money and losing what little thread still connected me to my family had been too great. But last night they'd snipped that thread themselves. They'd thrown me out like something broken and useless, convinced that because they lived under my roof and spent my money, the power was somehow theirs. They had completely lost sight of whose name sat at the top of the trust. I moved the cursor over the recurring transfer. The arrow hovered directly above the cancel button. My hand was perfectly steady. My breathing stayed slow and even. I could feel the crushing weight of an entire decade beginning to lift off my back. This wasn't merely a financial transaction. It was an execution. I was bringing down the guillotine on a decade-long illusion. Clicking that button meant dismantling the very foundation of Cody's constructed world. I pressed the trackpad. A confirmation window appeared, asking whether I was absolutely certain I wished to permanently delete this recurring payment. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. The $12,000 transfer disappeared from the dashboard. Erased. The safety net had been officially cut away. I settled back in the cheap plastic chair, listening to rain tap steadily against the motel window, and felt a cold, profound liberation wash through me. The bleeding had stopped. The parasite had been detached. I drew in a long breath of the stale motel air, preparing to move on to the insurance policies and the auto loans, ready to methodically burn down their financial house piece by piece. Before I could navigate to the next tab, a sharp chime cut through the room from the laptop speakers. A red alert banner slid down from the upper right corner of the banking portal. It was an emergency fraud notification tied to my secondary platinum card, the card I had handed Cody 5 years ago, strictly for medical emergencies. I clicked the alert. My eyes narrowed as the transaction details filled the screen. 2 separate charges had just been attempted, $4,000 apiece. A total of $8,000 at a downtown Italian designer boutique. The timestamp showed it was happening at that very moment. I stared at the screen as a cold, dark fury closed around my chest. It was 7 in the morning. Renee had shoved a 72-year-old man out into the freezing rain at 1:00 in the morning. And the first thing she'd done when daylight came was go online to charge $8,000 worth of designer clothing to his account. They didn't want distance from me. They wanted to drain me dry while I was still standing. I leaned in toward the screen, its glow reflected in my eyes, and moved to the security controls for the platinum card. The rules of this had just changed. I kept my gaze fixed on those pulsing pending transactions. $8,000 at a downtown Italian designer boutique swiped just minutes after my own son and his wife had driven me out into the winter dark. My hand hovered over the trackpad, not trembling from the damp cold of the motel room, but from a deep, nauseating clarity that was settling over me. I remembered the exact afternoon I had placed that heavy metal card in Cody's hand. 5 years ago, not long after he'd brought up a sudden health scare and the steep out-of-pocket costs his thin insurance wouldn't touch. I had sat him across from me in my study, the leather chair creaking as I leaned forward and passed him the card. I looked him square in the eye. This is for medical situations or genuine emergencies only. I wanted him to have something solid beneath him, a true backstop for when life went sideways. Now, staring at a glowing screen in this bleak little room, I understood clearly the only emergency Cody and Renee were facing was a shortfall in their luxury wardrobes. They were toasting my removal with a morning shopping run. I went into the card controls. In a single click, I chose to report unauthorized use and permanently freeze the account. A prompt asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. The system responded at once, throwing a bright red banner across the account. The card was now locked tight. Somewhere downtown, standing at a gleaming glass counter, Renee was about to hand that platinum card to a cashier. Within seconds, she would meet the very first consequence of her arrogance. That thought brought me no satisfaction, only a heavy necessary resolve. The bleeding had to stop, and no one else was going to do it. But the credit card was just the opening move. If I was going to cut these ties, I had to sever them completely, leaving nothing for them to grab onto. I picked up my phone, unlocked the screen, and dialed the 24-hour customer service line from a premium auto insurance provider. The automated system walked me through its prompts until a live representative came on the line. A polite young man named Kevin asked how he could help me that morning. I cleared my throat and kept my voice measured and firm. I need to remove 2 vehicles from my master policy. Right away, I told him. I read the license plate numbers off from memory, the sleek imported luxury SUVs that Cody and Renee drove around town, vehicles I had co-signed and folded into my corporate umbrella policy to shield them from financial liability and keep their monthly premiums almost non-existent. Kevin paused. The tapping of his keyboard carried over the line. Sir, if I remove these vehicles, they'll have no coverage whatsoever from this moment forward. Driving them on public roads without insurance is a serious legal violation. Are you completely sure you want to go ahead with this? I didn't pause for a single second. I am completely certain, I replied. Those vehicles are no longer my responsibility. I listened as he worked through the request, the finality of it settling over me like something solid and immovable. Those cars were Cody's most prized status symbols, the gleaming armor he wore to project the illusion of a self-made man to his country club crowd. By midday, pulling either one out of the driveway would carry real financial and legal consequences. One traffic stop, one fender bender, and the whole facade would collapse. I thanked Kevin and ended the call. I turned back to the laptop. The motel room was still cold, the wall heater rattling uselessly in the corner, but I no longer felt it. I was working with a clinical, detached precision I hadn't touched since the days I spent hammering out cutthroat freight contracts. I logged into the cellular provider portal and suspended the unlimited data lines on their mobile phones, setting the termination to take effect at the close of the billing cycle 3 days from now. I pulled up the country club management website and submitted a formal withdrawal of Cody's sponsored family membership. Every comfort, every convenience they moved through each day was anchored to my name, my unblemished credit record, and 40 years of my labor. I cut them away one by one, click by click, account by account. For decades, I had carried the crushing weight of their lives on my back, convinced that if I let go, Cody would collapse and never find his footing again. I had told myself my endless financial backing was a stand-in for the mother he'd lost too early away to hold the splintered pieces of our family together. But looking at the row of canceled accounts and frozen assets staring back from the screen, I couldn't pretend anymore. My support had not saved my son. It had gutted him. It had turned him into a hollow man who could look his 72-year-old father in the face and throw him out into a winter night without a moment's hesitation. I wasn't tearing his life apart this morning. I was simply making him live the life he had actually built for himself. I leaned back in the cheap plastic chair and pressed my palms against my tired, burning eyes. The work was nearly finished. The financial fortress they had been so comfortable inside was now effectively rubble. They just hadn't figured that out yet. I reached for the lukewarm cup of terrible motel coffee I'd poured from the lobby machine an hour earlier. The moment I brought it to my lips, a sharp, distinct chime cut through the silence of the room. Not the usual text alert tone, a high-priority email notification. I set the foam cup down on the scratched laminate desk and leaned toward the screen, The sender was the private security firm under contract to watch over the sprawling estate I had just been thrown out of. My pulse quickened as I clicked the subject line. The message was an automated alert. Someone was actively attempting to override the master alarm codes from the main control panel inside the estate foyer. I shut the laptop, that security chime still ringing in my head. Kicking me out into the winter rain hadn't been enough for Cody. He was now trying to lock me out of my own property by changing the master alarm codes on the premises. I didn't panic. I packed my computer into my worn briefcase, pulled on my damp overcoat, and walked out of that freezing motel room. I drove my rental car through the relentless morning downpour toward a Greasy Spoon diner, the kind of place defined by cracked vinyl booths, the thick smell of burnt coffee, and absolutely no risk of crossing paths with anyone from my son's manufactured social world. I settled into a quiet corner booth, ordered a plain black coffee, and waited. 20 minutes later, Sterling Prudhoe came through the foggy glass doors. A sharp 52-year-old attorney who always looked as though he had just stepped away from a high-stakes courtroom. He shook the rain from his dark umbrella, spotted me in the corner, and slid into the seat across from me. I skipped any warm greeting or idle talk. I unzipped my briefcase, pulled out the laptop, turned the screen to face him, and slid it across the table. Sterling adjusted his glasses and studied the display. I had left the evidence open for him. First, he read the text from Cody, the one demanding distance and ordering me out at 1:00 in the morning. Then he examined the banking portal, noting the canceled $12,000 monthly transfer. After that, his eyes moved to the security alert, showing the $8,000 in attempted charges on the frozen platinum card. Finally, he read the estate security notification, someone aggressively trying to breach the alarm panel in the main foyer. Sterling worked through every piece of it in complete silence. No sharp intake of breath. No hollow expressions of sympathy. He is built for legal combat, and he simply read the battlefield in front of him. Then he pushed the laptop back across the table, folded his hands, and spoke. "They think you are a helpless old man living in their house?" Sterling said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut right through the diner noise. "They forgot whose name is actually on the trust." I looked down at my coffee, feeling the full weight of those words. Sterling had managed my financial trust for 15 years. He knew every hidden asset, every property boundary, every offshore account I held. More than that, he was the only person who had ever looked me squarely in the eye and told me the hard truth about my own son. Years ago, shortly after Harriet passed, I had sat across from Sterling in his office to establish the blind trust. I wanted to shield the bulk of my $15 million logistics fortune from the Cody, give him a modest cushion while nudging him toward building his own discipline. Sterling had warned me plainly. He said that subsidizing Cody's lifestyle, even in part, would hollow out whatever character the boy might have developed. He told me that handing a young man access to unearned luxury would cause his entitlement to eventually turn malignant. I had argued with him hard that day. I said I was simply protecting a grieving son. Now, I sat in this dim diner booth, looking back at Sterling, the weight of my own foolishness pressing down on my chest. "You were right," I said quietly, my voice carrying every year of the past decade. "You were right about him all along." I had watered a weed and stood around waiting for an oak tree to grow. Sterling didn't gloat. He simply nodded, lifted his mug as the waitress topped it off, and took a slow sip. "You gave him everything Gerald Sterling said evenly. You gave him a mansion he did not buy, cars he did not earn, and a social standing he could never have funded on his own. It's no surprise he eventually convinced himself he was the true master of the estate. But delusions don't hold up in a courtroom. That property belongs entirely to the Harriet Whitlow Trust. You are the sole trustee. Cody is nothing more than a non-paying guest who has drastically overstayed his welcome. I asked Sterling where we stood legally regarding the house and the remaining assets. He explained that with no formal lease in place, Cody and Renee were considered tenants at will under the law. We could begin formal eviction proceedings the very next morning and lock down every remaining asset tied to my name. I leaned across the table and told him I wanted all of it set in motion immediately. I wanted the trust locked down to the point of total suffocation. I wanted every financial bridge scorched so completely that there wouldn't even be ashes left for them to sift through. I wanted them to feel the exact same biting cold of the reality they had forced on me. As Sterling began listing the specific legal filings we would need completed before the end of the business day, his cell phone buzzed against the laminate tabletop. He glanced at the screen. A faint frown settled over his usually composed face. He picked up the phone and raised a single finger, asking for quiet. I watched his expression move from measured professional curiosity to a hardened, calculating stare as he listened to whoever was on the line. Sterling ended the call and set the phone down slowly. He looked across at me, and the air in that corner booth suddenly felt dense and dangerous. "My firm automatically monitors legal inquiries involving your estate," he said, lowering his voice. "We set those alerts up years ago as a standard precaution." I nodded, waiting, my pulse already climbing. Sterling leaned in closer, his eyes fixed on mine with quiet intensity. "That was my senior paralegal. Your son just reached out to a downtown family law attorney, one who specializes in aggressive hostile conservatorships." A cold feeling moved through me that had nothing to do with the rain outside. I asked Sterling exactly what Cody had been asking about. "Cody is inquiring about the expedited legal process for having a senior citizen declared mentally incompetent." Sterling replied, the words landing like a physical blow. "He is attempting to argue you are suffering from severe dementia, so he can seize emergency power of attorney over your assets." The air in the diner felt heavier after Sterling delivered those words about conservatorships. The waitress came by and refilled our mugs, but I left mine sitting there until it went cold. I stared out through the rain-streaked window at the gray morning light, working through the sheer, clinical cruelty of what Cody was reaching for. He didn't just want the money, he wanted to erase my autonomy entirely, have me locked away in a facility stripped of my basic rights, so he could go on performing the role of a wealthy man without interference. I brought my focus back to Sterling. He had already opened his briefcase and drawn out a sleek silver tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He didn't need me to issue the order. We had known each other far too long for formalities. He was already building the countermeasures. "I'm filing an immediate irrevocable amendment to the trust," Sterling said, dropping his voice to a low, confidential murmur so the surrounding tables couldn't catch a word. "We are removing his name from every single clause. Gerald, he will no longer be the automatic successor trustee, nor will he have any standing as a beneficiary of the estate in any capacity. I need you to tell me exactly where you want the assets directed upon your passing." I didn't have to think. The answer had been waiting inside me for years. "Direct the entirety of the estate and all liquid assets to the regional veterans housing charity," I told him, my voice perfectly level. "Set up an endowment. Make sure the board of directors is fully insulated from any legal challenge my son might attempt after I'm gone." Sterling nodded, typing the stipulations with practiced speed. The decision brought a sudden, unexpected current of peace flowing through me. My late wife Harriet would have wanted it this way. Her father had served overseas and come home carrying deep, invisible wounds that never fully healed. Before Harriet passed away 10 years ago, her dying wish had been for us to use a meaningful share of the logistics empire I'd built to establish a foundation for struggling veterans. I had promised her I'd do it, but once I buried her, grief clouded everything. I looked at Cody, 25 years old at the time, and saw the only living piece of Harriet I had left. I told myself that if I gave him enough time, enough resources, and enough support, he would grow into a man capable of running the estate and honoring his mother's wishes. So I delayed the charity. I kept Cody as sole heir. I traded my wife's beautiful, selfless final wish for the fantasy that my son would eventually find his conscience. Sitting in that vinyl diner booth, I understood with perfect clarity that I had squandered 10 years waiting on a miracle that was never going to arrive. Cody wasn't going to build a legacy. He was going to liquidate everything I had built to cover his luxury car leases and designer wardrobe. Sterling turned the tablet around and pushed it across the sticky laminate table. The screen displayed the dense legal language of the trust amendment. I put on my reading glasses and worked through the paragraphs carefully. The wording was absolute. It legally severed Cody from the $15 million fortune, explicitly stating he was to receive nothing, disinheriting him entirely, and transferring full control of the estate to the veterans' charity the moment my heart stops beating. Sterling handed me a digital stylus. "I need your signature at the bottom," he said quietly. "Once you sign it, uploads directly to my firm's secure server and gets time-stamped. It's legally binding the instant your pen lifts from the glass. If Cody or his new lawyer attempt to file a competency claim later this afternoon, this timestamp will prove you executed this amendment before any such motion was ever introduced to a court. It will make their entire strategy look like a desperate retaliatory cash grab. I looked at the glowing signature line, waiting for my name. Signing away your only child is not a natural act. It cuts against every instinct a parent carries. For a brief moment, the image of Cody as a small boy flickered through my mind, running across the lawn of our first home, laughing while I chased him through the grass. But that boy was gone. The man who stood in his place was currently working to have me declared incompetent so he could take my home. I tightened my grip on the stylus and pressed it to the screen. I signed my name in firm, fluid strokes and handed the stylus back to Sterling. "It is done," Sterling said, pressing a final button on the screen. "The trust is sealed. The house is secure. He has zero legal standing, and he has absolutely no idea what is coming." I nodded, drawing in a slow breath of diner air. The defensive structure was fully in place. The legal shield was up, and the financial oxygen supply had been completely cut off. Now it was time to watch. I reached into the pocket of my damp overcoat and pulled out my cell phone, the one I had powered down in the back of the taxi outside the estate right after sending that single ominous text about who truly owned the property. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it. The screen came to life, showing the manufacturer logo glowing white against black glass. I laid the phone flat on the table between Sterling and myself. We both sat in silence, watching it as the operating system slowly came up. The home screen appeared. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. Then the device actually stalled the processor, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data, fighting to push through at once. Then the dam gave way. A sharp, frantic chime rang out through the diner, then another. Then a relentless, overlapping cascade of rings, buzzes, and alert tones. The screen blazed like a slot machine, paying a jackpot. 50 separate notifications flooded down the glass in rapid succession. 20 missed calls from Cody, 15 missed calls from Renee, and dozens of text messages written in capital letters and punctuated with exclamation points. Voicemail alerts stacked on top of each other. The financial barricades I had raised that morning had detonated squarely in the middle of their constructed world. Credit cards declined, accounts frozen. The panic had set in, and not a single piece of it was under their control. The phone on that sticky diner table didn't just ring. It shook with a violent, relentless energy as though the device itself had gone into a panic attack. I sat across from Sterling and watched the screen strobe with missed calls, messages, and stacked voicemail alerts. The trap I had set just hours ago had snapped shut completely. I reached over and picked the phone up. I scrolled past the flood of text messages packed with demands and threats and went straight to my voicemail inbox. The first message at the top was from Renee. I pressed play and raised the speaker to my ear. Her voice was nothing like the cold, flat indifference she had worn when she pushed me out the door at 1 in the morning. It was high-pitched and frantic, her breathing ragged at the edges. She was practically coming apart. I listened as she screamed into the phone, demanding to know what I had done to the platinum card. She was standing at the register, inside the downtown Italian designer boutique, the very same boutique where she had attempted to put through $8,000 in charges the moment the sun came up. Through her panic gasps, I could make out ambient store music and the hushed apologies of the sales associates. She told me the card had been declined not once, but 3 separate times. And she hadn't gone alone. She had brought 2 of her high society friends along for a morning shopping run, women whose admiration she had spent her entire life chasing. She was standing at that counter completely humiliated, holding up the line while the cashier looked at her with unmistakable pity. She demanded I call the bank immediately and fix the glitch before she completely lost her composure. I lowered the phone. A deep, steady clarity settled over me. Renee's obsession with appearances had always been her most exposed nerve, her true Achilles heel. From the moment she had started seeing my son, I had watched her eyes sweep every room she entered, quietly calculating the net worth of every person in it. She had built a digital life of private jets and imported champagne, every cent of it funded by my labor. She hadn't married Cody because he was a decent or driven man. She had married him for the aesthetic of wealth, the estate, the cars, the unlimited access to a life she had never earned herself. To have her polished image crack open in public in front of the very women she spent her life trying to impress was the kind of humiliation that would cut deeper than any financial blow. The mask had shattered, and she was bleeding in plain sight. I deleted her message and moved to the next. This one was from Cody, Where Renee's message had been raw panic, my son's was something closer to unhinged rage. I could hear him breathing hard into the phone as he demanded I switch it on, right that second. His voice shook with fury tangled up with rising terror. He yelled that his credit lines were frozen, that the bank was blocking every transfer from the operational account. He threatened that if I didn't fix it immediately, he would call his lawyers and push forward with the emergency guardianship. He ended the message by shouting that I was destroying his life. I set the phone face down on the table. He still believed the upper hand was his. He still believed his conservatorship threats held real power. He had no idea that Sterling had already legally severed him from the $15 million estate. The humiliating bite of financial ruin was at his doorstep, yet he was still trying to muscle his way through it. Sterling watched me from across the booth, his face calm and measured. He took a slow sip of coffee and gave a single quiet nod. The financial ecosystem they lived in has collapsed, Sterling said evenly. They are suffocating, and they are looking for someone to blame. I opened my leather briefcase and drew out my silver tablet. I needed to see exactly how the collapse was unfolding in real time. I unlocked the screen and pulled up the secure application tied directly to the estate's exterior camera network. I had paid for that state-of-the-art surveillance system to keep my family safe. Now, I was using it to watch their empire come apart at the seams. I selected the live feed for the main driveway, aimed squarely at the heavy wrought iron front gates. The winter rain was still coming down hard, smearing the camera lens slightly, but the picture was clear enough. I stared at the screen as a large heavy-duty vehicle rolled into the frame. It was not a delivery van or a neighbor's luxury sedan. It was a heavy-duty rollback tow truck, its yellow warning lights cutting through the gray morning fog. I watched in total silence as the heavy iron gates, which I had deliberately unlinked from Cody's control panel earlier that morning, swung open on their own to admit the truck onto the property. The vehicle crept up the long, manicured driveway, heading straight for the front of the mansion, where Cody's imported luxury sport utility vehicle sat parked. The consequences of my morning phone calls were arriving right on schedule. I kept my gaze fixed on the glowing tablet screen. The high-definition security cameras I had mounted around the perimeter of the Whitlow estate gave a razor-sharp view of the front driveway. The winter storm had not eased, and heavy freezing rain hammered the cobblestones. The rollback tow truck sat idling in the center of the drive, its diesel engine throwing a steady, thick ribbon of white exhaust that drifted lazily past the manicured hedges I used to trim with my own hands. The driver climbed out of the cab, yanking the collar of his neon high-visibility jacket up against the biting cold. He walked straight toward the gleaming black luxury sport utility vehicle parked near the front portico. That was Cody's pride and joy. The vehicle he drove to his elite social clubs to project the unshakable image of a self-made corporate titan, a rolling monument to his manufactured success. And now, a man in a rain-soaked jacket was dragging a heavy steel chain across the wet asphalt, lining it up to hook onto the front axle. Watching those thick metal hooks latch onto the undercarriage of that obscenely expensive car dragged a very specific painful memory to the surface. 10 years ago, when Cody landed his very first real entry-level job out of college, I wanted to set him on a path toward lasting success. I went to a reputable local dealership and bought him a perfectly reliable, sensible pickup truck. I paid for it entirely in cash. I pressed the keys into his hand and told him that a man who owns his vehicle outright answers to no one. I wanted him to feel the quiet pride of debt-free ownership. Exactly 3 months later, he drove that solid, practical truck straight to a luxury foreign dealership. He traded it in as a mere down payment on a leased high-performance sports car he absolutely could not afford. That single arrogant choice locked him into an endless cycle of toxic debt. He gladly swapped his financial freedom for the hollow illusion of status. Today that illusion was finally being towed away. On the tablet screen, the winch motor began to grind. The front wheels of the luxury vehicle lifted slowly off the wet pavement, tilting at a steep angle. Then the heavy oak front doors of the mansion burst open. Cody came sprinting out onto the wide porch wearing nothing but his dark silk bathrobe and a pair of thin leather slippers. He did not even register the freezing rain instantly soaking through his clothes and plastering his hair flat against his forehead. He threw his arms wide at the tow truck driver and screamed at the top of his lungs. Even with the camera's audio feed switched off, his frantic, panicked body language said everything. He was demanding the man release his car, immediately waving his hands, jabbing at the house, probably shouting about some massive bank error or a case of mistaken identity. The tow truck driver did not flinch. He was a seasoned professional who had almost certainly dealt with hundreds of angry, entitled debtors before. He simply shook his head, produced a laminated work order from his jacket pocket, and pointed firmly at the paperwork. The automatic payment had failed. The premium insurance policy had been abruptly canceled. The vehicle was a massive financial liability, and the bank wanted their expensive property back immediately. The driver turned his back on my screaming son and returned to the controls to secure the chains. Behind Cody, standing in the grand entryway of the mansion, was Renee. She was pulled tight into a thick cashmere sweater, gripping a ceramic mug of coffee with both hands. Her posture was rigid. Her face was strikingly pale and completely stripped of its usual arrogant, mocking smirk. She was watching her husband humiliate himself in the driveway, but her eyes kept skipping nervously around the property. She was watching the neighborhood come to life. The tow truck's flashing yellow warning lights bounced sharply off the darkened windows of the surrounding multi-million-dollar estates. The wealthy neighbors she had spent every waking hour trying to impress were undoubtedly peering through their expensive blinds, taking in the very public collapse of her flawless facade. Renee stepped slowly backward, retreating into the deep shadow of the foyer. Understanding that her carefully built social standing was dying right before her eyes, she did not move to comfort her husband. She left him to the rain. Cody flung his hands in the air, pacing back and forth across the wet driveway. He jabbed an accusatory finger at the driver one final time, then dug his cell phone out of his soaked bathrobe pocket with both hands. He began stabbing at the glass screen with his thumb, his face twisted in absolute desperation and helpless fury. He was hunting for the only person who had ever cleaned up his disasters. He was reaching for his permanent safety net. He needed the old man to fix this catastrophe. I watched him press the phone to his ear on the tablet screen. Exactly 1 second later, the device sitting on the diner table between Sterling and me began to vibrate. The screen lit up, showing Cody's name. Sterling glanced at the ringing phone, then looked back up at me with one eyebrow raised in silent question. The Greasy Spoon diner around us went on with its ordinary morning rhythm. The clink of cheap silverware and the low murmur of tired truck drivers formed a stark, almost surreal backdrop to the total financial destruction playing out on my screen. I did not move to answer it. I settled back in the vinyl booth and let the phone ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched Cody pacing in the freezing rain on the camera feed, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his free hand clutching his wet hair in pure panic. I reached across the sticky laminate table and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I raised the speaker to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I simply held the line open, breathing quietly. I stayed completely silent, letting the devastating, crushing weight of his situation carry across the digital connection between us. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the ragged, frantic sound of my son's breathing on the other end. The background noise of the Greasy Spoon diner seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the digital transmission of Cody's complete breakdown. He was hyperventilating, his breaths arriving in short, panicked bursts, as though he were literally drowning in the freezing rain I had just watched him standing in moments before. "Dad, you need to fix this right now." His voice was a taut wire pulled to the point of snapping. "The tow truck driver is not listening to me. The bank is telling me my accounts are locked. Renee is screaming at me. You need to transfer the money back immediately. Turn the cards back on. You are ruining my life." I sat perfectly still in the vinyl booth. I listened as his demands climbed from pleading straight into outright commands. He did not ask how I was holding up after being thrown out of my own home in the dead of night. He did not offer a word of apology for Renee's behavior or his own spineless silence. His entire world was caving in, and in his mind, I was nothing more than the negligent handyman who had stopped keeping his luxury simulation running. I did not give him a single word of comfort. I made no attempt to explain the legal maneuvers Sterling and I had just finalized. I simply pulled the phone from my ear, glanced at the call timer ticking upward on the glowing screen, and pressed the red button to cut the line. It went completely dead. I slid the phone into my coat pocket, thanked Sterling for his sharp legal work, and walked out of the diner. The freezing winter rain was still falling in heavy sheets, washing the grime off the industrial streets. I got into my rental car and drove the short distance back to the cheap roadside motel on the edge of town. When I pushed open the thin, hollow door of my room, a wave of stale, damp air met me head-on. The room carried the smell of harsh chemical cleaner and old cigarette smoke laid over years of neglect. I pulled off my wet overcoat and draped it across the back of the plastic desk chair. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the broken springs pressing into my back, and looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the stuttering fluorescent bulb above the bathroom sink. A sudden powerful wave of nostalgia moved through me. This dingy, depressing room did not make me feel beaten. It carried me back 40 years to when I was a young man in my 30s trying to grow my logistics company from a single rusted delivery van into a functioning regional fleet. I had lived in rooms exactly like this one. I spent countless nights on terrible mattresses just off the interstate, pulling thin blankets tight to save every possible penny. I ate cold canned soup for dinner so I could cover my driver's wages the next morning. I worked until my hands were raw and my spine ached, breathing diesel fumes and cheap motel soap for a solid decade. I built a $15 million empire on a bedrock of relentless grinding sacrifice. The rain outside intensified driving against the single-pane glass with a steady rhythmic drumming. It was the same kind of biting, freezing rain I had pushed through decades ago, hauling freight across state lines, while the rest of the world slept warm in their beds. I had endured that cold so my family would never have to shiver. I had given up my own comfort to raise a wall of security around my wife and my son. And this was my reward, a son who treated my life's work as nothing more than a bank account too empty. A son who would lock me out into the very same cold I had spent a lifetime shielding him from. Cody had never once seen that version of me. By the time he was old enough to understand the world, the empire was already standing. He grew up inside the sprawling suburban estate, sleeping on imported silk sheets and eating food prepared by private caterers. He assumed wealth was a natural condition, some invisible resource that simply floated in the air there for the taking. He was now burning through the very empire I had traded my youth to build, and doing it with a breathtaking absence of gratitude. The sharp contrast between my early years in rooms like this one and his current entitled meltdown only deepened the cold resolve settling in my chest. I reached into my pocket and drew out my phone. I needed to make certain my digital footprint was fully scrubbed. I went into the privacy settings and felt a sharp jolt of frustration I had forgotten to disable the location sharing feature. Cody had pushed to link our family accounts years ago, insisting it was for safety. I toggled the setting off, immediately cutting the digital tracking signal. But as I watched the icon vanish from the top of the screen, a heavy realization settled over me. He had been staring at his phone in full panic for the past hour. If he had checked the location tracking app before I shut it off, he already had my last known ping. I set the phone on the nightstand and waited. I did not switch on the television. I did not pace the room. I simply sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain work against the cheap glass, gathering my strength for the confrontation I knew was on its way. 2 hours passed in complete silence. Then the quiet of the motel room was blown apart by a violent, explosive noise. It was not a polite knock. It was heavy, aggressive pounding that rattled the thin wooden door inside its cheap metal frame. The force of the blows actually shook the flimsy security chain, holding the door shut from the inside. I did not flinch. I rose slowly, smoothing the creases from my trousers. I walked toward the door, my footsteps quiet on the damp carpet. I did not reach for the handle. I simply stood perfectly still, letting him burn through his first burst of fury. The pounding stopped for a brief moment, replaced by heavy, frantic breathing, filtering through the narrow hallway outside. Then my son's voice crashed through the thin wood, loud enough for half the motel to hear. "Open up! I know you're in there. I tracked your phone before you turned it off." He drove his fist into the door again, the wood groaning under the blow. He was no longer playing the concerned son. He was a cornered, desperate animal, and his true nature was bleeding through every word. "Open this door right now. I am your legal guardian. You are sick, Dad, and you need to hand me the account passwords before I call the police and have you dragged out of here." I stood mere inches from the door, listening to him weaponize my age and my health in a pathetic bid to claw back access to my money. He genuinely believed he could intimidate me. He thought that shouting legal threats through a cheap motel door would shatter my resolve. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing on the other side was not a helpless, confused victim. I was the architect of his destruction, and I was fully prepared to open that door and let the full weight of his situation hit him square in the face. I unlatched the security chain and turned the deadbolt. The click landed unnaturally loud in the small, cramped room. I pulled the heavy door open just far enough to stand in the threshold, my body filling the gap, blocking the entrance entirely. The frigid winter air rushed straight in, carrying the bitter tang of wet asphalt, damp clothing, and cheap exhaust from the highway nearby. Cody stood in the narrow exterior hallway, shaking visibly. He looked utterly pathetic. The dark silk bathrobe was gone. He had thrown on a wrinkled designer overcoat over a pair of sweatpants and shoved his feet into expensive leather loafers that the freezing rain was actively destroying. His hair was stuck flat to his forehead, and his chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. He took a sudden aggressive step forward, trying to use his size and momentum to push right past me into the room. I did not give an inch. I planted my feet on the faded motel carpet and locked my eyes onto his. For just a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely startled that a 72-year-old man could hold the line so solidly against someone half his age. He stumbled back slightly, dragging the rain from his eyes, his arrogance flickering. "You need to pack your things right now," Cody said, his voice vibrating with a toxic blend of panic and hollow authority. "I am taking you back to the house. You are clearly in the middle of some kind of severe psychological episode. You froze my accounts and canceled the insurance policies because you are confused. You do not even know what you are doing." I stared at him, letting his desperate lies hang in the freezing air between us. He was trying to gaslight me to my face, actually believing he could bend reality by simply speaking his delusions out loud. It was a tactic he had used successfully on Renee, on his wealthy friends, and on his business associates for years. But he was forgetting that I was the man who taught him how to talk. When I gave him nothing in return, his tone sharpened. He raised a trembling wet finger and pointed it straight at my chest. "If you do not give me the passwords to unlock the operational accounts right this second, I am calling my lawyers. I already spoke to them this morning." What you are about to hear is the moment when everything Cody believed he had already won begins to collapse beneath him, and what Gerald had quietly put in motion while his son was still celebrating. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait and let the truth do the work on its own terms? We are filing an emergency competency lawsuit today. A judge will look at what you pulled this morning, canceling everything without a word of warning, and declare you completely unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be placed under my legal guardianship before the week is out. You will have no say over anything. He stood there trembling in his ruined designer shoes, waiting for me to fold. He expected me to collapse under the crushing threat of losing my independence. He expected the old man to apologize, drop his eyes, and surrender the keys to the kingdom the same way I had after his mother died. I looked at the son I had raised. I looked at the man who had spent his entire adult life accepting everything I gave him and demanding still more. A profound, icy calm settled deep into my bones. The fear he was trying to plant in me simply glanced off the armor I had forged over the past few hours. "I do not need a psychological evaluation, Cody," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even register that cut cleanly through the noise of the falling rain. "What I need is a son who is not drowning in a $60,000 illegal sports betting debt in Las Vegas." The color drained from his face instantly. The arm he had been jabbing aggressively toward my chest dropped slowly to his side, as though the muscles had simply given out. The demanding, imperious posture vanished entirely, replaced by the cornered stance of a thief whose darkest secret had just been hauled into the light. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I did not give him time to recover. I leaned slightly forward, making certain he caught every syllable clearly above the storm. A year ago, I noticed strange discrepancies in the joint operational accounts. Large cash withdrawals with no explanation. Wire transfers to obscure shell companies. I did not want to believe my own flesh and blood was stealing from the family. I desperately needed to be wrong. So I quietly hired a private investigator, hoping he would clear your name and prove my suspicions were nothing but the paranoid fears of a grieving old man. I watched his eyes go wide with horror as the full weight of my words took hold. Instead, the investigator came back with a substantial mountain of your illegal debt. I continued, keeping my voice stripped of any emotion. "I know about the offshore betting accounts. I know about the aggressive, unsavory lenders you owe money to. I know that you have been siphoning my logistics fortune to cover your massive gambling losses while performing the role of self-made titan at your exclusive country club. You did not drive to this motel today because you are worried about my mental health. You came because you are terrified that the people you owe money to are going to break your legs when you default this coming Friday. The freezing wind ripped through the open doorway, but Cody was visibly sweating. His chest heaved as his mind raced. He had walked up to this motel room certain he was holding the ultimate trump card. He believed the threat of a forced conservatorship would bring me to my knees. Instead, I had just laid his most guarded, most dangerous secrets out on the bare concrete walkway for the whole world to hear. For one long, agonizing moment, we simply stared at each other. I watched the last traces of the boy I had raised dissolve into the cold air. The illusion of the devoted, concerned son was gone for good. The mask fell away, completely exposing the ruthless, cornered parasite that had been hiding underneath all along. A slow, dark sneer spread across his rain-soaked face. His expression twisted into something so deeply ugly and venomous that he looked like a stranger standing in front of me. "You think you are so incredibly smart." Cody spat, his voice dripping with raw, unfiltered malice. "You think cutting off the credit cards and freezing the bank accounts is going to stop me? Keep your cash, old man. I do not need your operational funds anymore." He stepped back, pulling his wet overcoat tighter around himself. He fixed me with a triumphant, mocking stare that sent a brief ripple of cold anticipation through my gut. "I have already listed the mansion for a private cash sale." He sneered, his lips curling into a wicked, hungry smile. "It is the family estate, and it sits in my name as your only heir. I have wealthy cash buyers walking through the property right now as we speak. I will have $2 million in liquid cash wired straight into my personal accounts by Friday afternoon. You can sit in this filthy motel room and rot for all I care. The house is mine." He spun on his heel, his ruined leather shoes slapping hard through the deep puddles on the concrete walkway. He did not look back. He drove off into the gray winter storm, leaving me alone in the doorway of the cheap roadside motel on the edge of town. I watched him disappear into the weather. He truly believed he had seized his ultimate victory. He was convinced he had found a brilliant loophole around my financial blockade and could strip away the crown jewel of the empire I had spent my life building. I eased the heavy door shut, closing out the freezing rain and the sound of his retreating footsteps. I crossed back to the small laminate desk and picked up my phone to call Sterling. The final trap had just been sprung. I stood motionless in the center of the cramped motel room, listening to the rain drive hard against the thin glass. My son's parting words echoed off the peeling wallpaper. He had declared with absolute arrogance that he had already listed my home for a private cash sale. He genuinely believed he would have $2 million wired into his personal accounts by Friday afternoon. I pulled out the hard plastic chair, sat down heavily at the small desk, and opened my laptop, letting the harsh blue glow light up the dark room. I did not allow the panic to swallow my rational thinking. I reached into my coat pocket, picked up my phone, and dialed my attorney's direct line. Sterling picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice completely level as I walked him through exactly what had unfolded on the concrete walkway outside my door. I described Cody's desperate physical state, his ruined clothes, and the venomous threat he had made about the estate. I told Sterling my son claimed the house was already on the active market and that cash buyers were touring the property at that very moment. As we talked, I could hear the steady clicking of a keyboard over the line as Sterling absorbed the details. He told me it had the sound of a panicked bluff designed to frighten me into restoring the frozen credit lines. I told Sterling that my son was a creature of desperate vanity and would absolutely try to liquidate anything within reach to keep his gambling creditors at bay. I instructed him to pull up the active high-end real estate listings for our specific county. We stayed on the line in silence as we both navigated to the most exclusive property portals in the region. I typed in the address of the sprawling suburban estate I had called home for decades. The results loaded instantly. My stomach tightened into a hard knot as a high-resolution photograph of my own wrought iron front gates filled the laptop screen. He was not bluffing at all. The mansion was actively listed and open for business. I clicked through to the property profile and began scrolling through the details, each one landing like a blow. The asking price was absurdly low, deliberately set at a fraction of the true market value to guarantee a fast, uncontested transaction. The bold text in the description read, "Gifted family estate available for a rapid cash sale only." The real estate copy was written with a sickening layer of forced charm. It boasted about the pristine Italian marble floors I had imported for my wife, and the custom crystal chandeliers she had chosen herself with such care. It highlighted the manicured grounds where I had planted roses in her memory. The listing agent promised a seamless closing for the right cash buyer. My own son was openly trying to fence the last standing monument to his mother's memory, like a stolen watch at a pawn shop, just to cover his illicit mistakes. A wave of nausea moved through me as I grasped how effortlessly he was prepared to erase our entire history for a quick payout. I read the listing details aloud to Sterling over the phone. He let out a low, humorless laugh. He asked if my son had completely lost his grip on reality. I told Sterling that Cody had simply operated under a lifetime of unchecked delusions. For years, my son had lived in that grand house, throwing lavish parties and playing the wealthy lord of the manor for his elite circle of friends. He assumed that, because I had always allowed him to treat the property as his own, he held some inherent automatic right to it. He fundamentally believed that, as my only child, the physical deed was already his the moment he decided he needed the money. He was tragically mistaken. I explained to Sterling that my son had completely overlooked the foundational legal architecture of our family assets. The deed to that magnificent house was never held in my personal name, and it was certainly never going to be in his. The property was held exclusively by the Harriet Whitlow Trust. When I purchased that estate years ago, I placed it inside a secure ironclad trust named after my late wife, specifically to shield it from exactly this kind of reckless financial behavior. My son could post the house on every website in the country, but he had no legal authority to sell a single blade of grass on that front lawn. I told Sterling we needed to contact the listing broker immediately and shut this charade down before someone actually put ink to a contract, but Sterling told me to hold on. The clicking of his keyboard grew faster and considerably more urgent. He told me he was digging through the public county clerk database to find out exactly what documentation my son had submitted to the real estate agency to get that listing approved. Any reputable broker would ordinarily demand airtight proof of ownership before marketing a multi-million-dollar property to the public. The silence on the line stretched out for a long, agonizing minute. The only sound in that miserable motel room was the steady rattle of the old wall heater straining against the winter cold. Then Sterling finally spoke, and the calm professionalism was entirely gone from his voice. His tone was thick with genuine alarm. He told me to refresh the real estate page and look at the digital attachment section at the very bottom of the property listing. I scrolled down and clicked on a small blue link labeled Legal Disclosures. A scanned document opened on my screen. It was not a property deed. It was an official filing from the county family court. I read through the dense legal text, and my blood ran completely cold. My son had not simply listed the house behind my back. He had filed an emergency injunction early that same morning while I was occupied freezing his credit cards. The document submitted under strict penalty of perjury claimed I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. The fraudulent filing stated that I was experiencing violent, unpredictable psychotic episodes and posed a direct, immediate danger to myself and everyone around me. It painted the portrait of a broken, sick old man no longer capable of tending to his own basic needs. But the final paragraph was the most terrifying thing I had ever read in my 72 years on this earth. It officially petitioned the county court to grant my son immediate temporary power of attorney over all my medical and financial decisions. He was bypassing the secure trust entirely by having me declared a mental incompetent and seizing total absolute control over every aspect of my existence. The cramped motel room suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. I stared at that legal document on my laptop screen. My own son had gone to county family court and sworn under oath that I was a violent danger to myself, suffering from advanced dementia. He was actively petitioning a judge to strip away my basic human rights and hand himself complete dominion over my physical and financial life. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Sterling did not waste a single second on shock. He closed his laptop and pushed it into his leather briefcase in one motion. He looked at me with sharp urgency and said we were in a race against the clock. If a sympathetic judge signed that emergency order before hearing our side, my son could legally dispatch police to this very motel to collect me and have me committed to a psychiatric facility. We needed unassailable medical proof of my sanity, and we needed it immediately. I grabbed my damp overcoat and followed Sterling out into the freezing winter storm. The drive to the city medical center was tense and wordless. The tires of Sterling's sedan hissed across the flooded asphalt, while the wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy downpour. I stared out the passenger window, watching the gray city slide past. A deep, heavy sorrow had settled into my bones. Aging is a strange and merciless process. You spend your entire life constructing an empire carrying the weight of hundreds of employees navigating complex logistics operations. Your mind is a sharp instrument built for solving crises. Yet the moment your hair goes white and your pace slows, the world decides you are vulnerable. Your own flesh and blood looks at your decades of hard-earned wisdom and sees nothing but a soft target ripe for conquest and exploitation. My son was weaponizing my age against me, turning the natural passage of time into a tool to rob me of my own life. I tightened my grip on the door handle, refusing to let his malicious fiction take root. We pulled up to the towering glass and steel medical complex at the center of the city. We moved quickly through the bright, sterile lobby, bypassing the crowded waiting areas, and rode the elevator straight up to the private executive health wing on the top floor. We were there to see Dr. Calder. He was the chief of internal medicine and had served as my primary physician for over 30 years. More than that, he was the man who had stood beside me during the darkest passage of my life. 10 years ago, when my wife Harriet was fighting her final losing battle against illness, Dr. Calder was the one who managed her care. He spent countless hours in that hospital room, walking us through treatments and offering real comfort when the medicine stopped working. He understood the depth of my grief, and he knew the full measure of my character. He knew without question that my mind was sharper than most men half my age. Dr. Calder was reviewing patient files in his spacious corner office when his receptionist showed us in. He looked up, caught off guard by the unannounced visit, but his expression shifted immediately to deep concern the moment he read the grim resolve on our faces. Sterling stepped forward and laid out the legal situation quickly and plainly. He described the fraudulent court filing and stated that we needed a thorough, expedited cognitive evaluation performed on the spot, and a signed, notarized medical certificate confirming that I was fully competent and in complete command of my mental faculties. Dr. Calder did not ask unnecessary questions. He grasped the gravity of what was at stake and immediately cleared the next hour from his schedule. I settled into the stiff leather examination chair while Dr. Calder produced a standard cognitive assessment protocol. For the next 45 minutes, I underwent a rigorous mental evaluation. It was deeply humiliating to be compelled to prove my own sanity simply because a greedy child wanted to fund his debts, but I poured every ounce of my mounting anger into sharp, total focus. I worked through complex mathematical equations without hesitation. I recalled long sequences of random numbers, forward and backward. I sketched intricate geometric shapes from memory and tore through logical puzzles with the same cold efficiency I had once used to negotiate corporate freight contracts. I did not stumble once. My mind moved like a finely tuned instrument, cutting through every test with complete precision. When the evaluation was finished, Dr. Calder set his clipboard on the desk and looked at me with a warm, steady smile. He stated that my cognitive function was not merely normal, it was exceptional. He turned to his computer and composed a comprehensive medical declaration laying out the full results of the examination. He printed it on official hospital letterhead and signed his name at the bottom with a heavy black pen. Sterling took the document immediately and locked it inside his briefcase. The legal shield was forged. We now held the definitive weapon to dismantle the fraudulent court injunction and defend my autonomy. The crushing tightness that had gripped my chest since I first saw that real estate listing began to loosen. I rose from the chair and extended my hand to thank Dr. Calder for dropping everything to come to my aid. But as he shook it, his professional smile faded. He gestured for Sterling and me to sit back down in the chairs across from his desk. The atmosphere in that bright office suddenly felt very thick and very cold. Dr. Calder removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes, looking deeply troubled. He looked straight at me and spoke in a low, measured voice that sent a fresh wave of ice running through my veins. He said he was glad we had come in today because there was something deeply disturbing he needed to bring to my attention. He drew a slow breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Your son came into this very office 3 days ago." Dr. Calder said, his words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. "He requested a private consultation regarding your health. He sat right where you were sitting now and told me you were completely losing your mind. He claimed you were turning violent and that he needed to protect the family. Then he reached into his jacket, produced a thick envelope of cash, and offered me $10,000 on the spot to falsify a medical record and officially diagnose you with severe advanced dementia. Walking out of the medical center, I felt a profound shift deep inside my chest. The grief of a betrayed father was swept aside, entirely replaced by the cold calculation of a man preparing for a hostile takeover. Dr. Calder had provided official medical clearance and a signed affidavit laying out my son's attempt to purchase a fraudulent dementia diagnosis for $10,000. Sterling locked the documents inside his leather briefcase. The legal shield was now loaded with absolute proof of criminal intent. We climbed back into my attorney's sedan. The winter storm had finally begun to ease, leaving behind a cold, gray afternoon. I told Sterling to drive straight to the main branch of my primary bank in the financial district. I needed the ultimate weapon to obliterate the delusional real estate listing my son had posted online. We bypassed the crowded teller lines and were escorted down to the secure vault area in the basement. The heavy steel vault door swung open with a solid click that echoed through the metallic corridor. I walked down the aisle and found my personal safety deposit box. I slid in the key, turned it, and pulled out the long metal drawer. Inside, resting beneath a stack of old corporate bonds and tax records, was a thick manila envelope. I opened it and drew out the original physical deed to the suburban estate. The heavy parchment felt rough and substantial in my hands. Holding that document released a sudden flood of vivid memories. I remembered the exact afternoon I signed it decades ago. I had just closed my first major international freight contract. I purchased that sprawling estate outright in cash to give my late wife Harriet the garden she had always dreamed of. I made certain the deed went directly into a secure trust to protect her future and shield our family from outside threats. This piece of parchment was not merely a property document. It was the physical embodiment of my entire legacy. Standing there in that vault holding it in my hands, it did not feel like a relic. It felt like a loaded weapon. I set the original deed on the private viewing table inside the vault room. Sterling opened his briefcase and methodically laid out the rest of our arsenal. We arranged the documents side by side beneath the bright fluorescent lights. We had the irrevocable trust amendment cutting my son completely out of the estate. We had the unassailable medical certificate from the chief of internal medicine confirming my full cognitive clarity. We had the sworn affidavit documenting the criminal attempt to bribe a medical professional. And now we had the original watermarked physical deed, proving that my son had absolutely no legal standing to sell my home. Sterling looked down at the carefully arranged legal portfolio. He gave a slow nod, his professional composure giving way to an expression of genuine predatory satisfaction. He told me we held enough documented evidence not only to have the fraudulent conservatorship injunction thrown out, but to have my son arrested for criminal conspiracy and fraud. We gathered the papers, secured them inside a heavy binder, and left the bank vault ready to execute the final maneuver. We returned to the car and sat in the leather seats with the engine running and the heater blowing. Sterling opened his silver tablet to review the legal filing schedule. He planned to submit the medical clearance and the trust amendment to the county clerk without delay. That move would effectively neutralize the emergency family court injunction my son had filed that morning. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard, aware that we were about to dismantle my son's entire world before the sun went down. Just as Sterling opened the digital portal to begin uploading the files, a sharp alert chime cut through the quiet cabin. It was a push notification from the exclusive real estate application Sterling had downloaded earlier that morning to track the active listing of my home. Sterling tapped the notification banner, his eyes moving quickly across the updated property profile. I watched his jaw tighten. The faint trace of satisfaction disappeared from his face, replaced by sudden and focused urgency. He turned the tablet toward me. My son had not simply left the property sitting online to gather digital inquiries. He had aggressively compressed his timeline to liquidate the estate. The listing had been updated with a bold red banner stretched across the top of the screen. The text announced that the property was hosting an exclusive invitation-only open house strictly for verified cash buyers and private investment groups seeking an immediate expedited closing. My son was actively trying to sell my home today. He was working to secure a large non-refundable cash deposit before the weekend arrived, desperately hoping to use that stolen money to settle his gambling debts in Las Vegas. I looked closer at the event details and felt my stomach drop. The private showing was not scheduled for tomorrow. It was not set for later that evening. The text stated clearly that the open house was beginning in exactly 1 hour. The buyers were already on their way. They were driving to my home, prepared to walk across my imported marble floors and negotiate a fraudulent cash deal with a man who did not own a single brick of the foundation. Sterling dropped the tablet onto the passenger seat and shifted the car into gear in one motion. There was no time to sit in a parking lot, feeding documents into a slow county clerk portal. If my son accepted a cash deposit from a private buyer, it would create a tangled legal nightmare that could drag through civil court for years. We had to stop the transaction at its source. We had to confront the delusion head-on. The legal guillotine was fully assembled, and it was time to drop the blade. I watched the city streets blur past the window as Sterling steered the sedan away from the financial district. We moved through the city toward the affluent retail corridor where the most prestigious businesses operated. The winter storm clouds were beginning to break apart, but the atmosphere inside the car remained taut and charged. We were not heading to the Whitlow estate just yet. If we were going to tear down my son's illusion completely, we needed to begin with the people who had been propping it up. We pulled to a stop in front of a sleek glass and steel building that housed the most exclusive luxury real estate brokerage in the county. This was the firm my son had chosen to market my home. They were the ones currently running the fraudulent open house, relying on forged documents and blind faith in my son's manufactured social standing. I stepped out of the car and buttoned my damp overcoat. My boots hit the wet pavement with heavy, deliberate purpose. Stepping through the pristine glass doors of the brokerage, I was immediately met by the heavy scent of expensive leather and artisan coffee. The lobby was engineered to make ordinary people feel small. It was a towering monument to surface-level wealth, soaring ceilings, and enormous digital displays scrolling endlessly through multi-million-dollar property listings. A young receptionist behind a vast slab of imported marble looked up at us with a rehearsed, condescending smile. She asked politely whether we had an appointment. Sterling did not break stride. He walked straight to her desk, placed both hands flat on the marble surface, and told her we were not there to schedule a property tour. He instructed her to bring the managing broker out immediately and to let him know that the true legal owner of the Whitlow estate had just walked through his door. The practiced smile left her face instantly. She picked up the desk phone and murmured a few rapid words into the receiver. Less than a minute later, a tall man in a tailored Italian suit came through a frosted glass office at the far end of the room. He moved toward us, projecting total authority. His gold name badge identified him as Mr. Beckett, the senior managing partner of the firm. He looked at Sterling first, then shifted his gaze to me. I watched a remarkable transformation unfold in real time. Beckett stopped dead in the middle of the lobby floor. The polished, dismissive smile vanished from his face entirely. He blinked several times, staring at me as if a ghost had just strolled into his building. He did not see a confused, senile old man. Beckett belonged to a dying breed, an old guard operator who had built his whole career serving the city's true financial elite. The local business journals were his Bible. He didn't need an introduction. Standing before him was the man who had grown a single rusted truck into a regional logistics empire that commanded commercial freight for 40 years. My name alone told him everything about where I stood. "Mr. Whitlow," he said, and whatever arrogance had been in his voice a moment before simply evaporated. The pitch dropped, the posture changed. "Sir, meeting you is a genuine honor. I came across your profile in the Trade Gazette years back." I gave him nothing in return. No handshake, no nod, just a hard, unblinking look and 3 words, "private conference room now." He swallowed and moved fast, steering us into a soundproofed glass-walled office that sat above the street below. The door swung shut behind him. He started in on coffee, but Sterling was already working the latch on his leather briefcase before the offer was finished. One by one, Sterling drew the documents out and arranged them across the conference table without saying a single word. The first item down was the printed medical certificate signed by the Chief of Internal Medicine, an airtight declaration of my full cognitive fitness. After that came the irrevocable trust amendment, the instrument that had already cut my son off from the entire $15 million estate without appeal. Then I reached into my coat and produced the thick manila envelope I had pulled from the bank vault that morning. I drew out the original watermarked deed to the Whitlow estate and pushed it across the table, telling Beckett to study the name on the master deed carefully. He bent over it. The color left his face like water draining from a tub, slow at first, then all at once. He grasped within seconds what it meant. He had handed junior agents the authority to market a multi-million-dollar property on nothing more than the word of a desperate gambling addict. My son had shown up with a leased luxury sports car and a good watch, and that had been enough. I kept my tone measured and flat as I walked him through the exact dimensions of what he had done. His brokerage, I explained, was currently hosting a cash-only open house at my estate, an event my son had arranged without a shred of legal authority. Any purchase agreement his firm produced would make them a willing participant in federal fraud. Beyond that, my son had gone to family court and claimed I was mentally incapacitated, yet the document now sitting on Beckett's own table proved that claim was a fabrication from start to finish. A line of perspiration appeared at Beckett's hairline. He could see it clearly. Now, a fraud case of this scale landing on the evening news would not merely embarrass him, it would permanently strip him of his real estate license and reduce everything he had spent decades building to rubble. He offered a stammering, hollow apology, insisting his firm had relied on the documents my son brought in. I leaned across the table and told him plainly that placing your faith in a liar is a habit that costs far more than it's worth. Before sunset, I said criminal charges would be filed against every party who had touched the unauthorized listing. That sent Beckett over the edge entirely. He could see the ship going under and understood he had a narrow window to pull the transaction back before some eager cash buyer handed my son a non-refundable deposit. He lunged for the telephone on the desk. His fingers were rattling against the handset as he stabbed the speaker button, ready to ring the estate and order his agents to kill the open house and yank the listing off every public platform. He never got to the last digit. Sterling moved. He brought his hand down firmly over Beckett's, trapping those trembling fingers before they could complete the call. Sterling turned to look at the broker, and the smile on his face carried no warmth at all. "Don't call him," Sterling said, his voice low, and even the kind of quiet that carries more weight than shouting. "We'll deliver the news ourselves." Beckett withdrew his hand from the phone without argument, the full and final nature of the situation registering across his face. He gave a single nod, color completely gone from his cheeks, and settled back into his chair like a man who'd just been told his verdict. We left the document copies right there on the table, a permanent record of the liability now sitting on his shoulders. I turned away from him without another word and walked out, Sterling at my side. We cleared the building and came out into the sharp cold of the afternoon. Every safety net my son had woven around himself was gone. The enablers were neutralized. He had no one left running interference. We climbed back into the car and Sterling fired the engine. Less than 20 minutes stood between us and the Whitlow estate. I watched through the passenger window as the dense city block slowly gave way to the wide, tree-lined avenues of the county's wealthiest neighborhood's roads I had known for decades. The man who had slipped into a damp taxi and fled this part of town at 1:00 in the morning was not the man sitting in this seat now. I was coming back as the architect of what came next. I was coming back to bring the full weight of reality crashing down on my son's carefully constructed illusion. The dashboard clock told me the open house was well into its run. Somewhere inside my house, strangers with money were examining the crown molding, discussing offers, and treating a fraud as though he had something to sell. We were about to walk through those heavy oak doors and end the performance. Start to finish, the drive from the luxury real estate brokerage to the Whitlow estate clocked in at exactly 18 minutes. Sterling wound through the curving roads that separated the city's noise from the hush of the county's affluent outskirts. Through my window, the familiar stone walls and clipped lawns scrolled past scenery I had absorbed thousands of times heading home after long days running freight. I knew every bend. Those drives used to mean the working day was behind me, and the quiet of the house Harriet and I had built together was ahead. This drive meant something else entirely. When we turned onto my street, the scene snapped into focus all at once. The heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance to my property stood fully open, both panels thrown back against the hedges. The driveway, every foot of it, was choked with expensive vehicles. Sports cars and silver-black luxury SUVs sitting high on their frames. Imported sedans parked haphazardly across the cobblestones. It looked less like a real estate showing and more like the valet line at a black tie event on a Thursday afternoon. My son had reeled in the region's most aggressive cash buyers with the promise of a fast off-the-books deal on a premium property. Sterling eased in near the property's edge, well clear of the collection of cars. We got out into the cold, clean winter air. The earlier rain had moved on, and the grounds looked scrubbed and sharp in the gray light. I stood a moment, taking in the brick face of the mansion rising above me. I thought about the day the last stone went up. I thought about carrying Harriet over the threshold on the day it became ours. Every wall represented something we had given up and built back together. Watching strangers pick through it like it was laid out on a sale table somewhere put a cold leaden fury in the center of my chest. We mounted the wide front steps. Both oak doors at the entrance had been propped open, an open invitation to the parade of buyers flowing inside. I didn't go in. I held up a hand, and Sterling stopped beside me just inside the shadow of the front portico, back from the door out of sight. I needed to watch them first. I needed to see how my son and his wife were pitching this fiction before I stepped into the middle of it and ended it. From that vantage point, I had an uninterrupted sightline straight through the grand foyer and into the formal living room. The room was full, well-dressed people drifting through the space, voices low, eyes moving across the ceilings and walls. Standing at the room's center, commanding it all with practiced ease, was Renee. She wore a white tailored suit, sharp and spotless, her hair set, just so one hand balancing a crystal tray of champagne flutes. She moved through the clusters of suited men, like she had done it 100 times, touching an elbow here, offering a glass of there, keeping that smooth, rehearsed smile going without a crack. Her voice reached me over the background hum of conversation. She was positioned near the grand staircase with a pair of developers gesturing upward as she spoke. Her story was that she and Cody were simply ready to move. On the estate was more house than their lifestyle called for now, and they felt it was time to let another family step into it. The ease with which she delivered that lie was something to behold. She talked about this house as though her hands had touched every brick, as though the question of its future was hers, and hers alone to answer. My gaze followed where Renee's manicured finger pointed. Her finger was aimed at the ceiling, specifically at the massive crystal chandelier suspended from the dome of the foyer, its facets catching the afternoon light. Something sharp and painful moved through my chest. That piece wasn't just a fixture. Years ago, I had quietly flown to Murano, Italy, and tracked down a master glassmaker to commission it by hand. It crossed the Atlantic in a shipping crate and was installed overnight, while Harriet slept a surprise I had planned for months as an anniversary gift. When she first saw it lit, she broke down completely. It was the jewel I had placed at the center of everything I built for her. And now, Renee was dangling it in front of investors like a complimentary throw-in. I heard her tell the room that any buyer who brought a strong cash offer before the afternoon was out would have the imported Italian chandelier left in place, a generous goodwill gesture from her and Cody. She was auctioning off my dead wife's memory to grease a transaction built entirely on fraud. Over near the grand marble fireplace, I found Cody, bourbon in hand, shoulder resting against the mantelpiece, deep in conversation with a prosperous-looking man clutching a leather portfolio. Cody had the roll-down, cold, relaxed posture, expansive gestures, casually throwing around talk of closing timelines and wire transfers like a man who had done it 100 times. He had absolutely no idea that everything he had constructed downtown was already rubble. His emergency court injunction, he believed, had worked. In his mind, I was still confined to some cheap motel room, stripped of my legal standing, while he put the finishing touches on the biggest theft of my life. I had watched long enough. The spectacle of their unearned confidence had hit its ceiling. I glanced at Sterling, who hadn't moved from beside me, briefcase still locked in his grip. He gave me one firm nod. No words needed. I stepped out of the portico's shadow and moved straight to the center of the open doorway. I wasn't going to slip quietly into my own house. I set both palms flat against the heavy oak doors and drove them back hard until the brass hinges let out a long, grinding groan against the stone. The impact of wood against masonry rang through the foyer like a shot. I crossed the threshold and planted both boots on the imported marble floor, pulling myself to full height, every ounce of authority I had forged across decades of corporate warfare sitting on my shoulders. I did not look like a confused, declining old man. I looked like the man who owned this place and had come back to prove it. The reaction was immediate. The boom of the doors swinging open pulled heads toward the entrance. Something traveled through the crowd, a slow wave of recognition, then hesitation. The murmur of conversation began to thin. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased. Within 5 seconds, the energy of the open house simply collapsed. A dense, pressing silence settled across the grand living room, as every person in it turned to look at me. The last echo of the doors faded into nothing. Nobody moved. The cash buyers, the developers, the socialites, every one of them had gone mid-sentence to complete stillness, their attention fixed on the man in the doorway. I didn't shift my posture by a degree. I stood in my damp winter overcoat boots firm on the marble, staring straight across the room at my son. Cody was beside the fireplace, his glass of bourbon lifted and frozen halfway to his lips. The blood left his face fast. That polished mask, the confident property magnate, the gracious host, slid off him in an instant. What replaced it was the look of someone who has just understood that they have been caught completely and finally. But Cody was built on instinct, and that instinct was to lie faster than he panicked. I watched him lower the bourbon glass onto the mantelpiece, pull in a breath, and come across the room toward me at a quick, purposeful stride. His color was already shifting from ashen white to a flushed, angry red, and he was arranging his face into something that read for the audience like a devoted son managing a painful family situation. He raised both hands in a calming gesture and addressed the room directly. He wanted the ladies and gentlemen to forgive the interruption. His father, he explained with practiced sorrow, was gravely ill, deeply confused in the grip of advanced cognitive decline. He told them the situation had deteriorated sharply in recent weeks, and that he and Renee were in the painful process of arranging a transition to a secure care facility for my protection. Nothing to be alarmed about, I had simply wandered off, and he would take care of it quietly. He was standing in my own home, broadcasting to a room full of strangers that I was a lost, addled old man, using my age as a weapon to protect a fraudulent sale. While he performed, I looked past him and found Renee. She was standing frozen near the grand staircase, still holding the champagne tray, her face stripped of every trace of composure. She knew there was nothing wrong with my mind. She was the one who had packed my things and put me out the door at 1:00 in the morning. She read my expression and understood immediately this was not a man who had come back to ask for anything. This was a man who had come to collect. Cody closed the last few feet between us and reached out, wrapping his fingers hard around my upper arm, sinking them into the wet wool of my overcoat. The intention was transparent. Spin me around, march me out through the front doors before I could say a single word to the people standing behind him. As his grip tightened, something unexpected broke loose in my memory without warning. I was standing in the first modest house we ever owned. No empire, no millions, none of it built yet. Cody was 6 years old and utterly terrified of the dark during a severe winter ice storm. I was sitting on the edge of his bed, holding that exact hand while he shook and wept. I had curled my large, rough fingers around his small ones and told him the monsters couldn't reach him. I had spent the next 3 decades of hard labor making certain that promise held. I had built walls around him that were never supposed to fall. Now that same hand was clamped around my arm with contempt, trying to push me out into the cold so he could cash out my legacy and settle his gambling debts. Whatever remained of my paternal instinct, whatever thread of mercy I had been carrying, snapped at that moment of contact. The father in me had died the day he signed those fraudulent court papers. What stood on this marble floor was something older and harder. I was 72 years old, but my body had been built by decades of hauling heavy freight. I drove my boots into the marble, set my shoulder, and twisted my arm sharply against his thumb. The leverage broke his grip cleanly, and he stumbled backward several steps into the center of the foyer, barely keeping his feet. He stood there genuinely startled, his eyes wide with a shock he couldn't hide. He had spent so long persuading himself that I was fragile and spent that he had stopped questioning it. He pulled in a breath to address the crowd again, maybe to call for someone, but I stepped deliberately to one side before a single word left his mouth. I gave the floor to my attorney. Sterling Prudhoe emerged from the shadow of the front portico and moved into the room. He walked straight past Cody without so much as a glance, treating my son like a piece of furniture that happened to be in the way. He carried himself with the unhurried, predatory certainty of a trial lawyer, stepping into a courtroom he had already won. His path went directly toward the massive marble kitchen island that divided the grand foyer from the formal dining room. The investors drew apart ahead of him, watching in bewildered, uneasy silence. Sterling set his leather briefcase onto the island's surface and snapped the brass locks open with 2 sharp metallic cracks. He reached inside and drew out the thick, precisely organized stack of legal documents we had spent the last 12 grueling hours assembling: the medical certificate establishing my sanity, the irrevocable trust amendment cutting my son off from the fortune and the original watermarked physical deed to the Whitlow estate. He lifted the entire stack high and brought it down hard onto the marble. The impact detonated through the silent house like a thunderclap, a deep percussive crack that sent vibrations running through the crystal glasses still held in the hands of the stunned guests. That sound was not incidental. It was the trap closing. It was the machinery of justice locking Cody inside the wreckage of his own scheme, and it announced to every person in the room that whatever had been happening here was finished. The shockwave from the documents hitting the marble rippled across the grand room and wiped out the last of the open house's comfortable atmosphere. The sudden concussion of noise commanded every pair of eyes in the place. Investors, developers, socialites, all of them stood frozen, staring at the thick stack of parchment resting on the counter. Sterling gave no one a moment to recover or reach for a fresh lie. He straightened his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate adjustment, a movement that radiated pure, quiet authority. Then he turned away from my trembling son and addressed the assembled buyers directly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was low and resonant, filling the high-ceilinged space without effort, riding above the imported rugs and antique furnishings. He identified himself as senior managing partner of his firm and the official legal counsel of record for my estate. He told the room that his duty required him to halt the proceedings immediately before anyone present became an unwitting participant in a serious federal fraud. The word hung there in the air, fraud quiet and lethal, like something dropped into still water. I watched the room change posture in real time. These were shrewd, self-protective people who did not survive in their financial bracket by ignoring warning signals. Their polished social ease curdled fast into hard-edged suspicion. Sterling laid his palm flat on top of the documents. He stated plainly and without qualification that his client Gerald Whitlow was the sole and exclusive legal owner of this property. He explained that the deed was held under the Harriet Whitlow Trust, and that I was the only living trustee with standing to authorize any sale. He directed his gaze at the developer who had been reviewing closing timelines with my son just minutes before. Sterling told the whole room, that Cody Whitlow held absolutely no equity in the estate, no power of attorney, no legal guardianship, no right of survivorship that could give him the authority to list, negotiate, or transfer the property. My son's mouth moved. He was trying to find words, trying to construct some defense from the debris of his collapsing story. He managed only a stammer. Sterling shut it down immediately with a precise, merciless legal characterization. Cody Whitlow was, in the eyes of the law, nothing more than a non-paying tenant who had far exceeded any reasonable welcome. I shifted my attention across the room to where Renee was still standing near the grand staircase. The transformation on her face was something to witness. Every trace of that poised, rehearsed confidence she had worn all afternoon was gone. The silver tray of champagne flutes she clutched began trembling so badly the expensive crystal clinked together in a rapid, anxious rhythm. She looked at the documents on the island, then slowly moved her eyes to her husband. For perhaps the first time in their marriage, she was seeing who she had actually chosen. Not the billionaire heir, not the magnate in waiting, but the real man underneath the borrowed lifestyle. I could read exactly what was moving through her mind. Her entire adult life had been organized around status, around being seen in the right places beside the right kind of man. She had married Cody because he lived in a sprawling estate and wore the convincing costume of generational wealth. She had absorbed his arrogance and his volatility because she believed the inheritance was real and that eventually all of it would belong to her. Now she was standing in that same foyer and understanding that the foundation had never existed. The inheritance, the estate, the endless money, all of it was fiction. She had bound her future to a man buried in illegal gambling debts who possessed nothing of his own. A man who had been living on the patience of the very same old man she had put out into the freezing rain the night before. The full weight of that landed on her all at once, financial ruin and public disgrace arriving simultaneously. The investors did not linger. Wealthy people are not forgiving when they have been maneuvered toward an illegal transaction, and they are especially unforgiving when it has been done in front of witnesses. The hospitality of the open house dissolved without a trace. The developer with the leather portfolio snapped it shut with a single sharp motion. He turned to face my son and made no attempt to mask his contempt. He told Cody he had wasted his afternoon and that his legal team would be examining the fraudulent property representation closely. The rest of the buyers moved in the same direction. Champagne glasses came down on whatever surface was nearest. Marble counters, antique side tables. The lid of the grand piano abandoned mid-celebration. A hard, purposeful movement toward the oak front doors followed. Coats were pulled from the hall closet. Muttered conversations about audacity and liability passed between departing figures. Nobody offered my son so much as a backward glance of sympathy. They treated him like an exposure risk, several of them openly threatening suits for misrepresentation and fraud as they cleared the foyer. Cody stood in the center of the grand living room, completely motionless, watching them go. These were the people he had built his entire life trying to impress. Now they were streaming out of his borrowed house in a wave of contempt. He reached a hand out weakly as though some gesture might reverse the moment, but his fingers closed around nothing. The sound of expensive engines turning over and accelerating down the long driveway carried through the open doors, the audio of his social standing expiring. In under 3 minutes, the house was empty of strangers. The silence that fell back into the room was dense and suffocating. It was Sterling, my son, my daughter-in-law, and me standing in the ruins of everything they had built. I watched Renee set the silver tray of champagne flutes carefully onto a side table. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Sterling. She turned her body fully toward her husband. The panic that had seized her face a few minutes ago had transformed into something far colder and far more dangerous. Her eyes were fixed on him, burning with undisguised venom. The alliance built on mutual greed had caved in on itself, and what was left between them was war. The last sound of the departing cars faded from the driveway. The grand foyer fell into complete stillness. The buyers were gone. The illusion was dead. Renee remained near the staircase, the emptied tray on the table beside her, her hands still unsteady. She had turned entirely toward her husband. What had been panic was now something sharper, the cold, focused fury of a woman processing the full scope of the lie she had married into. She wasn't looking at him with love or grief or fear. She was looking at him the way a person looks at someone who has cost them everything. Cody hadn't moved from the center of the Persian rug. His tailored suit seemed to hang differently on him, now slightly too large, as if the physical collapse of his grand design had taken something structural out of him. He looked at me. His chest was rising and falling hard as he tried to absorb the total destruction of everything he had manufactured. Sterling Prudhoe did not give him a moment to find his footing. Sterling was a master of legal warfare, and he knew exactly where to land the killing blow. He reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a single sheet of heavy legal paper. He didn't drop it onto the marble island with a crash. He walked directly up to Cody and held the document out, forcing my son to confront the official county seal stamped across the top. Cody stared at it, eyes wide with unmistakable dread. He refused to reach for it. His hands stayed pinned at his sides, as though making contact with the paper would seal something he could not take back. Sterling simply opened his fingers and let it go. The sheet drifted down and settled face up on the floor directly at my son's feet. Sterling's voice was perfectly measured calm, on the surface lethal underneath. "This is a 48-hour eviction notice," Sterling said. "The locks change on Monday." Those words struck Cody like something physical. His knees gave. Not a stumble, not a stagger, a clean collapse. He went straight down onto the cold marble landing hard beside the eviction notice. The confident property magnate, the man who had orchestrated all of this, was simply gone. The person who had put me out into the freezing rain at 1:00 in the morning, without a second thought, had vanished. What remained was a frightened, hollow boy. He lifted his face toward me from the floor, eyes wet and wide with genuine terror. "Dad, please!" Cody begged, his voice splintering into a desperate, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot throw me out. I have nowhere to go. I owe people money. They will kill me if I do not pay them. Please, Dad, I am your son. I will do whatever you want. I will go to rehab for the gambling. I will get a job. Just please do not take the house." I stood there in my damp winter coat and looked down at my only child on his knees. I searched my heart for some trace of mercy. I looked for the deep driving love that had pushed me to build everything I built in the first place. I expected to feel the tearing anguish of watching a son fall apart completely. But as I studied his tear-streaked face, I found nothing. The capacity for that kind of mercy had been burned away entirely. Over the past 10 years, Cody had run a slow, relentless campaign of psychological erosion against me. He had taken the grief I carried over his mother's death and turned it into a lever, using my guilt to strip me of every resource and every ounce of dignity I had. He had treated me like a piece of infrastructure, a human bank account, to be drawn down and discarded when it no longer served his purposes. He wasn't crying out of remorse for anything he had put me through. He was crying because he had finally run out of other people's money to spend. Before I could say a word, Renee erupted. The shock had burned off, and pure survival instinct took its place. She didn't drop to her knees beside her husband. She came across the foyer at a hard march, her expensive heels striking the stone in sharp percussive beats. She stood directly over Cody and unleashed a raw, ugly fury. "You lied to me?" She screamed, her voice breaking apart and bouncing off the high ceilings. She drove both fists hard into his chest. "You have absolutely nothing. You are completely broke. You told me you owned this estate. You told me your father was leaving you millions of dollars. You are nothing but a pathetic squatter." Cody grabbed at her hands, pleading with her to stop, begging her to stay and work through it together. Renee wrenched herself free with a violent jerk. She looked at him with an expression that held nothing but pure disgust. Then she turned and ran up the sweeping grand staircase, heading for the master suite to collect her designer bags and put this marriage behind her for good. Cody stayed on his knees on the marble. He was sobbing without restraint, calling after his wife to come back down, calling to me to tear up the eviction notice. He was a man crushed under the full weight of everything his own greed had built around him. I looked at the wreckage playing out across the foyer of my home. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I delivered no final speech, made no demand for an apology. The silence I carried out with me was total. I turned my back on my son and walked through the heavy oak front doors with Sterling at my side. I descended the stone steps and drew in a long breath of cold winter air. Something in my chest released a pressure I had been carrying for longer than I could name. I left the Whitlow estate behind me in full screaming collapse. Their greed had finally turned inward, and it was consuming them alive. Exactly 1 week later, I stood alone in the center of that same grand foyer for the last time. The imported marble floors were bare. The furniture, the Persian rugs, the carefully selected artwork, all of it had been cleared out by a professional estate liquidation company. The massive crystal chandelier, the one I had secretly flown to Murano, Italy to commission for Harriet, still hung from the soaring dome above, but the room beneath it was hollow. It was no longer a home. It was a shell of brick and glass with nothing left inside it. Cody and Renee were gone. They had cleared out within 48 hours of Sterling handing them the eviction notice, retreating into the wreckage of their own destroyed reputation. They were left to work out how to survive, without my accounts propping up their delusions. Sterling Prudhoe stood beside me, briefcase in hand, as he had been through every turn of this. We weren't there to look back. We were there to complete the final transfer. Sterling laid out a thick stack of legal documents on a small folding table the liquidators had left in the empty room. Not eviction notices or trust amendments this time, but the official endowment papers. I picked up a plain black pen and began signing my name across the bottom of each page. With every line of ink, I formally transferred ownership of the multi-million-dollar Whitlow estate to the Regional Veterans Housing Foundation. I was finally making good on the wish my late wife never got to see fulfilled. Harriet had never truly wanted this sprawling suburban fortress. Early in the rise of my logistics company, when money first began arriving in serious amounts, I purchased the estate as a sweeping romantic gesture, convinced that the sheer scale of the place was the reward our years of struggle deserved. I believed that the size of the property would somehow shield us from the world. But Harriet was a woman of quiet, genuine tastes. She used to tell me that the towering brick walls and the acres of manicured grounds felt like a beautiful gilded cage. She stayed because she believed the prestigious neighborhood and the elite school district would give Cody the platform to become something honorable. She felt they had outgrown that opulent lifestyle decades ago. Harriet had always loved the ocean. She told me more than once that her only real wish was to grow old somewhere small and quiet where she could fall asleep to the sound of the tide. I had kept this massive property long after she was gone, holding on to the image of a family for my son's sake. Signing it over to the charity was not a loss. It was the release of something I had been carrying too long. It was the liberation of my soul. Sterling collected the signed papers and returned them carefully to his briefcase. He extended his hand, and I shook it, a firm, unhurried grip from the man who had engineered my legal salvation. He gave me his word that he would manage the remaining transition with the charity board personally, and that Cody's creditors would never be able to touch a cent of the endowment. I walked out through the front doors and turned the key in the lock for the last time. I did not turn around to look at the columns or the long sweep of the driveway. I got into my car and drove away from the affluent suburbs, away from the socialites, the developers, and the corrosive legacy of wealth that had never actually been earned. I drove south toward a destination I should have set out for a decade ago. The long drive down the eastern seaboard gave me time to sit inside the silence of what my life had become. I watched the city skylines dissolve into open road and stands of dense pine. I reached the coast of South Carolina just as the evening tide was coming in. I had bought a small cedar shingle cottage right on the edge of the water months before, but Cody's grip on my life had kept me from ever going there. Now the cottage was the whole of my world. It was a modest cedar shingle cottage right on the edge of the water, weathered gray siding, a broad wraparound porch opening directly onto the vast Atlantic. No imported marble underfoot, no crystal chandelier overhead. Just solid, unpretentious construction built to hold its own against the hard coastal weather. I was up the next morning, well before the sun cleared the horizon. No cell phone rattling against the nightstand, no sharp demands from an ungrateful daughter-in-law cutting through the silence. No crushing awareness of a family working methodically to dismantle my sanity. What woke me was the ocean, the steady, unhurried rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. The air in the cottage was cool and carried the clean, bracing smell of sea salt and weathered driftwood. I went into the small kitchen and put on a simple pot of dark coffee. No private caterer, no elaborate spread, none of that. I poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug and pushed open the door to the wooden deck. The coastal wind found the collar of my flannel jacket immediately, but it felt like exactly what I needed. I set my forearms against the railing and watched the darkness overhead shift through deep violet and then into burning shades of orange and gold. The sun broke over the water and threw a long, brilliant path of light across the rolling surface of the ocean. I took a slow sip of black coffee and let the warmth move through my chest. I glanced at my phone sitting on the small table beside me. The screen was dark and stayed dark. No alerts from bank managers. No frantic messages from my son. No desperate appeals for another bailout. The relentless noise of the life I had endured for a full decade had gone completely quiet. Cutting my only child out of my life was the most painful, wrenching thing I had done in all of my 72 years. It demanded that I deliberately break my own heart in order to salvage my own soul. But standing on that deck with the cold, salt air moving around me, I understood that the manufactured guilt I had carried for so long had finally released its hold. What I had come to know at real cost was that character cannot be purchased and love cannot be sustained through subsidy. Genuine respect grows from honesty and the courage to hold a line, not from a lifetime of financial sacrifice with nothing asked in return. I watched the seabirds wheel and plunge toward the rolling waves and felt something deep and steady settle inside me, a tranquility I had almost forgotten was possible. If you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, then you already know this was never really about a house. Gerald walked out of that cottage door the next morning with less than he had built and more than he had felt in years. It cost him his son. It cost him the illusion of a family he had funded long past the point when it made any sense. I believe God has a way of stripping away everything that was never truly yours to carry, and what Gerald found on that porch listening to the tide was the peace that comes when you finally stop subsidizing your own mistreatment. These are the lessons I carry from his story. If someone is only loyal to your money and not to you, that is not love. It is a transaction. Know the difference. Document everything before you act. Proof is the only language that cannot be argued with in a courtroom or in a crowd. Never sign over your power while you are still breathing and still sharp. Legal control is the last thing you let go of. And if you find yourself wondering whether you have given too much to someone who gives nothing back, you already know the answer. You have known it for a long time. Stories like Gerald's father, stories about quiet endurance and a dad's revenge delivered without a single raised voice remind us that the most powerful people in the room are sometimes the ones saying the least. If this story moved, you leave a comment and tell me what it stirred up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. I am grateful you spent this time with me. Until next time, take good care of yourself.